wasn't supposed to mean anything. Thomas repeated those words often, even years later. But no matter how many times he said it, he knew deep down it wasn't true. It meant something. Maybe everything. It was July 2008. Thomas was 36, freshly out of a complicated relationship, and had sworn off dating. He lived in Chicago, worked in logistics, a job stable enough to pay bills, but dull enough to numb him. His life was a routine of commutes, coffee, emails, and late-night takeout eaten alone. On weekends, he jogged by the lakefront, watched baseball, and occasionally met friends for a beer. Predictable and comfortable. When his younger sister Sarah called him one Thursday afternoon, he nearly ignored it. She rarely called without a reason, and he wasn't up for family drama. But something nudged him to answer. Sarah had planned a weekend at a cottage in a small lakeside town in Michigan. Her husband Ben suddenly couldn't go due to work commitments. The cottage was already paid for, and Sarah didn't want to waste it or go alone. Would Thomas join her? Thomas hesitated, but looking around his cluttered apartment, he realized he had no real reason to stay. Maybe a change of scenery would do him good. He said yes. They drove out Friday morning. Sarah talked the whole way, filling the car with chatter about her friends, her job, and the latest show she'd discovered. Thomas listened absently, feeling his tension slowly unwind with each passing mile. They arrived at the quaint lakeside cottage just after noon. The place was rustic, charming, smelling faintly of cedar and lake water. They unpacked quickly and then headed into town for groceries. That's where they ran into Natalie. Natalie was an old friend of Sarah's from college. She was 38, divorced, and had relocated to a small town nearby a few years earlier to teach high school history. Natalie had an easy smile and a warm, effortless presence. She and Sarah hugged, talked rapidly, and then Sarah turned to introduce Thomas. When Natalie shook his hand, Thomas felt something shift, a subtle, undeniable awareness. She had eyes that seemed genuinely interested in seeing the person she spoke to, rather than just waiting for her turn to talk. The encounter was brief, but Thomas felt strangely lighter afterward. Later that evening, Sarah invited Natalie over to grill dinner by the lake. They sat around a picnic table as dusk fell, eating grilled corn and burgers, the conversation flowing easily. Thomas found himself talking more openly than he had in months, sharing stories about work, life, and the sense of emptiness he'd been feeling. Natalie listened carefully, occasionally adding insights that felt quietly profound. After dinner, as stars filled the sky, Sarah excused herself early, saying she was exhausted. Thomas and Natalie stayed behind, sitting near the lake, listening to the water lap gently at the shore. Their conversation deepened, moving from casual chatter to genuine introspection. Natalie spoke about her divorce without bitterness, describing it as necessary, painful, but ultimately freeing. Thomas shared about his recent breakup, admitting aloud for the first time that it had left him questioning what he truly wanted from life. They talked for hours, their words fading into comfortable silence at times, punctuated only by the distant calls of loons. It was past midnight when Natalie finally stood to leave. They lingered a moment longer, neither quite ready to end the evening. Finally, they said goodnight, exchanging shy smiles as she disappeared down the path. The next day, Thomas awoke feeling strangely hopeful. Sarah noticed his good mood, teasing him lightly about Natalie, but he brushed it off. Still, when Natalie texted Sarah later, inviting them for a hike, Thomas felt an unmistakable thrill. The hike was idyllic, winding through dense forests and along sunny open meadows. Natalie and Thomas naturally paired off, their conversation picking up where it had left off. They talked about family, dreams they'd set aside, and fears they'd quietly held on to. It was the kind of conversation that made hours feel like minutes. That evening, the three of them built a small fire by the lake, roasting marshmallows and sharing stories. As the night wore on, Sarah again retired early, leaving Thomas and Natalie alone once more. This time, their quiet closeness turned tender, and without hesitation, Thomas leaned in and kissed Natalie. It wasn't fireworks or cinematic drama. Instead, it was gentle, real, a moment filled with warmth, relief, and a sense of rightness Thomas hadn't felt in years. Sunday arrived too quickly. They spent the morning at a small cafe, sipping coffee, neither mentioning the impending goodbye. Finally, Natalie spoke softly, acknowledging their separate paths. There were no promises, just an acknowledgement of something special and fleeting. Thomas and Sarah drove back to Chicago in comfortable silence. Life resumed. Days turned into weeks, weeks into months. Thomas never contacted Natalie again, respecting the unspoken agreement they'd made. Yet Natalie remained with him, in subtle, quiet ways. In moments of reflection or loneliness, he thought of her easy laughter, the thoughtful pauses, the genuine curiosity she had about the world. She had reminded him what connection felt like, real, unhurried, honest connection. Years passed. Thomas eventually married, had children, and settled into a fulfilling life. But even then, in quiet moments, he remembered Natalie and that weekend. It wasn't longing or regret, it was gratitude. Gratitude for a weekend that showed him love could be gentle, brief, yet profoundly meaningful. There were times, after difficult days, when Thomas would take long walks around his neighborhood, not to go anywhere, but just to feel still again. And during those walks, she often came to him, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a quiet presence in his mind. He imagined what her life looked like now, if she still taught, if she ever thought about those 2 nights by the lake. He never told anyone about her. Not really. Not his wife, not his friends. It wasn't a secret, just sacred. One of those chapters in a life that doesn't need retelling to be real. And sometimes, when the kids were asleep and the house was quiet, Thomas would find himself stepping outside just to look at the sky. And he'd remember the stars above that lake, and how, for the first time in a long time, he'd let someone see him without armor. That was the gift. That was the point. Not the kiss, or the closeness, or even the promise of something more. But that for 2 nights, someone had seen him clearly and kindly, and let him do the same. And that, in its quiet way, had changed everything. Thank you for listening. Until the next heartbeat in a story. Subscribe and stay for more love in every word.